Welcome to Invisible Architecture. I'm Christina DiStefano, luxury real estate advisor and creator of the Emotional ROI method. This podcast explores the psychology of space, design, and luxury real estate, and the unseen emotional and identity-driven forces that shape how we live, buy, and belong. Here we look beyond square footage and market data to understand how homes are experienced emotionally long before decisions are made. Because the most powerful architecture is invisible first. Today I want to explore an idea that might feel subtle at first, but has very real implications for how luxury real estate is being bought and sold right now. Because if you're selling condominiums or working with developers, or even just observing how high-level buyers are making decisions, there's a shift happening. And it's easy to miss if you're not looking for it. For decades, luxury real estate has been defined by ownership. The larger the residence, the more prestigious the building, the more permanent the asset, the clearer the signal. Ownership functioned not only as a financial milestone, but as a form of identity. It represented stability, success, arrival. To own was to have reached a certain level of permanence in both life and status. But that definition is quietly evolving, not disappearing, but becoming less central. And what's interesting is that the shift is subtle enough that much of the industry is still operating inside an older assumption. That ownership is the ultimate objective. That if the product is strong enough and the pricing is correct, the desire will follow. But increasingly, that's not how decisions are being made. And this is where the conversation starts to matter a little more. Because at the highest levels of the market, ownership alone has begun to lose some of its meaning, not because buyers no longer value real estate, but because ownership by nature is static. And today's luxury buyer is not. They're globally mobile, professionally dynamic, personally evolving, often at a pace that makes permanence feel, in some cases, restrictive rather than aspirational. And what that really does is shift the underlying question. It's no longer, what do I own? It becomes, what does this allow me to access? Access to a certain pace of life, access to specific environments, access to convenience, service, and ease. And maybe most importantly, access to a version of themselves that feels aligned with who they're becoming. And that distinction may seem subtle, but it has very real implications for how real estate is perceived and ultimately how it is sold. Luxury real estate has always been tied to identity, but historically that identity was expressed through permanence, a primary residence, a legacy property, a place that anchored someone's life. Today, identity feels more fluid, and increasingly it's constructed through a series of environments rather than tied to a single location. A buyer may spend part of the year in New York, and not because it's their singular home, but because it supports a specific dimension of their life. Intellectual, professional, maybe cultural. Another location serves a completely different function. And what begins to emerge is not a single residence, but a network, a system of places that collectively support how someone lives. And in that context, access becomes more powerful than ownership, because access allows for curation, and curation allows for alignment. This is where a different idea starts to take shape, something I think we'll be talking about more over time. The idea of a lifestyle portfolio, because traditionally we've thought about real estate portfolios in purely financial terms, such as asset location, appreciation, or diversification. But there's a parallel structure forming, less visible, but just as influential, a lifestyle portfolio, where each property is not simply an investment, but a strategic placement within a broader life design. One location offers proximity to business and culture, another offers social energy, another offers retreat, and another offers distance and perspective. Each plays a role, and none are expected to do everything. This is where things become very real for anyone selling condominiums, because the competitive set changes. A buyer is not just comparing your building to the one down the street. They're comparing it to a different version of their life, a different city, a different rhythm, a different way of living. And this is where many developments quietly lose alignment, not because the product isn't good, but because it's positioned as a standalone asset instead of as a part of a larger system. Now, this decision itself at this level is rarely made on purely financial terms, because financial metrics tend to converge. You can have comparable properties, similar pricing, similar amenities, and yet outcomes look completely different. The difference is emotional. It's what I describe as emotional ROI. Does this make my life easier, more coherent, more aligned? Does it support the way I actually want to live day to day? And increasingly, access-based environments deliver strong emotional returns because they prioritize experience over permanence. They allow for movement, for adjustment, for responsiveness to a life that isn't fixed. And for many buyers, time, not capital, is the most constrained resource. So access becomes a way of optimizing how life is actually lived. And this is where developers, whether consciously or not, have already started to respond. Because the most successful projects today are not just buildings, they function as ecosystems, integrated environments that combine service, wellness, social infrastructure, and operational ease. In other words, they're designed around access. Access to hospitality level service, access to curated environments, access to a lifestyle that feels cohesive. And when a developer gets that right, it no longer needs to rely on traditional selling language because the value is felt, not explained. But this evolution introduces something important, a new layer of dependency. Because as ownership becomes less central, the experience becomes the product. An experience is delivered by people, by operators, by brands, by management, which is why trust becomes significantly more important. And this is where I think a lot of the real decision-making actually happens. Because buyers are no longer just underwriting real estate, they're underwriting the ecosystem. They're asking questions like, will this deliver? Will it be consistent? Is the brand credible enough to support the lifestyle being promised? And this is often the hidden variable behind performance. Two buildings can look nearly identical, but one feels certain and the other feels ambiguous. And in luxury, ambiguity is risk. Now, if you zoom out a little bit, this shift also reflects something broader. We're operating in a world that feels less predictable, economically, geopolitically, socially. And in that kind of environment, flexibility becomes valuable. Liquidity becomes a feature. Optionality becomes a form of security. And access-based thinking aligns with that because it allows buyers to stay adaptive, to move with opportunity instead of being tied to a single fixed decision. And what ultimately comes out of all of this is a redefinition of what home actually means. Home is no longer singular. It's not one place, it's a network, a series of environments that collectively support a life. And each property within that network serves a role. It becomes a node. And the value of that node is not just what it is, but what it unlocks. This is where the real role of the developer and the advisor really starts to shift. Because if you're selling a condominium today, you're not simply selling a home. You're offering entry into a system, into a way of living, into a specific configuration of identity and experience. So the question is no longer, is this a good apartment? It's, what does this unlock? And this is where the shift from ownership to access becomes practical, not theoretical. Because it changes how developments need to be positioned, how narratives are constructed, and how conversations with buyers actually unfold. The most effective projects today are not framed as assets to acquire. They're framed as environments to enter. And the advisors who can articulate that, who can translate not just what a property is, but what it enables, those are the ones who create with clarity and ultimately alignment. Because luxury buyers are not trying to accumulate more space, they're trying to design a life. And increasingly, that life is not built around permanence. It's built around access to environments, access to experiences, and access to identities that feel aligned. Ownership is part of that equation, but it's no longer the center of it. Alignment is. Because in the end, the most valuable properties are not the ones people simply own. They're the ones that allow them to become more of who they already are. And that's the invisible architecture. Thank you for listening to Invisible Architecture. I'm Christina DiStefano, luxury real estate advisor in New York City. New episodes are released twice a month, where we explore the unseen forces shaping how we live, choose, and belong. Until next time, remember, the most powerful architecture is invisible first.